If you're thinking about getting a point and shoot film camera just like the one I have with me right here, then watch on as I'll be sharing 7 things I like and dislike about the Nikon L35 AF. I had this Nikon L35 AF for slightly more than 2 years now, and honestly prior to this I do not own any point and shoot film cameras. Mainly because I'm the kind of person who likes to have a little bit more creative control on how my images turn out, and for that matter I would much rather use a more manual camera instead. Truth is, I didn't purchase this. I got this as a birthday gift from my sister, and at first I was a little bit skeptical because my sister don't really know much about film cameras to begin with, and I was a little bit curious on why she picked this particular model. So it turns out that she did her research. She asked around, and somewhere along this process, this camera was recommended to her. I mean, okay, naturally I'm happy to have a new camera to play around with, but honestly I didn't have high expectations for it. My first impression of this camera was that it looked pretty cool. The condition was almost mint, just that I wasn't quite sure whether it was working properly or not. So the first thing that I did was to shoot a test roll, basically just to make sure that the shutter works and there were no light leaks or anything. As I was shooting my test roll, I was kind of getting used to the feel of the camera, and I started to realize that, hey, this is actually quite a fun camera to use, and I was seriously considering using it as my secondary camera or my backup camera. So then I finished shooting the test roll, and after developing it, I was just checking the negatives to see if there were any blank frames or any light leaks. Basically just to check if there were anything wrong with it. Thankfully there were none of those, so I decided to take a closer look and scan the negatives to see if the shots are in focus. And when I inspected the scans, I realized that this camera is special. I mean, the exposure was spot on and the images are super crispy. I was honestly in denial, and that was when I started to do more research on this camera just to try and dig up some dirt on this seemingly perfect camera. I mean, just Google it. It's really difficult to find fault with this camera. There's so many things to like about this camera that it is impossible for me to just narrow it down to 7 things. And honestly, there's very little to dislike about this camera as well. And I needed to be very nitpicky in order to come up with 7. So enough of the backstory, let's start with the easy part first, and that is 7 things I like about the Nikon L35 AF. Number 1, the design. I mean, look at this. Nothing screams the 80s like an unapologetic blockish form factor. Everything is where it should be. Nothing sticks out like a sore thumb. It's just simple, unpretentious, and honestly quite timeless looking. Uh, I would even go as far as saying that this looks iconic. Those who know this camera can recognize this a mile away, or those who don't will actually take notice and ask me about it. So I'm pretty confident to say that I'm not the only one who's digging this 80s retro design of this camera. Number 2, the lens. This is probably the most defining feature of the L35 AF. I mean, this lens is amazing. It's either Nikon made a bold decision to equip this point and shoot with an amazing lens, or it's a fluke and they themselves didn't realize how good of a lens it will be. Now this only applies to the L35 AF. Subsequent models like the L35 AF2 spot a similar 35mm f2.8 lens, but the difference is this model, the lens has 5 elements in 4 groups, while the lens in the subsequent models have 4 elements in 3 groups. Now, I'm not entirely sure what kind of difference that will make, but most people will swear that the original lens is better. Number 3, manual ISO settings. Another difference that sets the L35AF apart from its subsequent models is the option to allow the user to set their own ISO settings. The reason why I like this feature is because I like to overexpose my color negative films. And if the camera doesn't allow you to set your own ISO, it will automatically set it for you by reading the DX coding on your film canisters. Some will say that that is convenience, but for me, I like the option to not shoot my film at box speed. Plus, this also allows me to shoot film stocks with no DX coding on their labels, And what that means is I'm not limited by the kind of film that I can shoot using this camera. Number 4, exposure compensation. Again, this is another function that gives me a little bit more control, and they remove this feature for subsequent models as well. So over at the side of the lens, there is a lever that when pressed allows you extra 2 stops of exposure. And what that means is either a slower shutter speed or a bigger aperture or both. Now this is mainly used for backlit subjects where the camera meters for the bright background and your subject will tend to be underexposed if you do not compensate for it. I seldom use this feature, but it's nice to know that I have it as an option at my disposal. And you can get really creative with this at night if you do not want to use your flash. So you just have to compensate it with the extra 2 stops and you can get really trippy motion blur pictures from this. And yeah, it's a quite fun feature to have actually. Number 5, filter thread. Now this is something that I really like because you don't come across a lot of point and shoots that allow you to add a lens filter, let alone one that's 46mm in size. And this is great because if you shoot a lot of black and white film, this allows you to add a yellow filter on top, for example. And what's cool is the meter, I'm not sure you can see it, it's quite near the lens, and if you were to add a ND filter on top of it, for example, it will actually meter through the filter and they will try to compensate accordingly. Again, just very well thought out and something which I appreciate and like, and for some reason they remove this feature in the subsequent models as well. So if you really need to add a lens filter, then you need to take note of this point that only the L35AF has it, the subsequent models doesn't have it. Number 6, common batteries. This should be one of your major considerations if you're getting a point and shoot or any camera in that sense. Now the L35AF uses very commonly found AA batteries, and to be honest, I don't think those will ever be phased out. So you can rest assured that you can continue using your camera as long as AA batteries are still around. Number 7, third-party accessories. Now if for some reason you're not really into the native 35mm focal length of the L35AF, fret not, there are wide and telephoto lens attachments designed specifically for the L35AF. Now these are pretty hard to come by and they're not made by Nikon, but it's still pretty cool to know that there were third-party manufacturers back then that used to produce accessories specifically for the L35AF. If you would like me to do a review video on these, just let me know in my comment section below. Okay, before I move into what I dislike about this camera, if you are enjoying this video so far, I would appreciate it if you hit the like and subscribe button. It will help me to grow this channel and create more content like this for you in the future. Okay, with that out of the way, let's move on to 7 things I dislike about the Nikon L35AF. Number 1, limited ISO range. Okay, I have to admit I'm being very greedy on this. I mentioned that I really appreciate how this camera allows you to set your own ISO, but this version, which is the earlier version, only has a range of 25 to 400, and what that means is I cannot rate my film at 800 or even 1006, and that is something that I often do for my black and white films. The later versions, however, have a range of 50 to 1000, which is much better, but honestly ISO 1000 is a weird setting and it's not something that I would use or rate my film at, to be honest. Number 2, the flash. The flash for me is a hit and miss. Sometimes at the right distance, it looks like how a flash shot taken with a point and shoot should look like, while most of the time it's just not powerful enough and it shouldn't even bother trying. On top of that, there's no way to prevent it from popping up if it feels that you need it. If you want to override it, you need to manually push it back down after it pops. And the thing is, it pops up very loudly. And this could potentially work against you if you want to be as inconspicuous as possible. Number 3, battery compartment. Now I did mention that this camera is well designed aesthetically, but the battery compartment is by far the weakest link. Now, I'm not sure whether it's the material that they use, but these tend to wear very easily from the constant opening and closing. And as a result, they might not close as securely as they did before. Worst case scenario, the entire door might even fall out. It is also very common to see people duct taping their battery compartment doors on the L35AF, and that actually tells you a lot about how flimsy these battery compartment doors are on the L35AF. Number 4, the shutter button. Now, how you focus on this camera is that you need to half press, and you will see this needle in the viewfinder moving towards some icons that indicates the distance you are trying to focus at. The problem is that there is a sweet spot that you need to get used to, and initially when I first started using this, I would accidentally take a shot when I'm trying to focus, and that can be quite annoying sometimes. Number 5, reliability. Now, this applies to all old cameras, especially cameras with electronics, and that there is always a risk of it failing. So far, I have sent this camera back for repairs twice. The first time I noticed there was this blurry vignette around my images. It's not really a motion blur, as I noticed that the center of my image is still sharp, and it was shot in bright daylight. So it turns out that one of the components is faulty, but luckily for me, the shop still has replacement parts for it, so we managed to get it fixed. The second time, my flash couldn't pop, even though I shoot in like low light or I changed the ISO to like 25, it just wouldn't pop. Although I mentioned that it's something that I hate, it still suggests that there was something wrong with the camera. So I sent it back, and apparently it was something to do with the magnets that control the popping of the flash. But thankfully that was an easy fix, and so far it hasn't happened to me since. So in a span of 2 years, there were already a couple of problems associated with the camera, but I was lucky that there were still parts for it, or it was still fixable. However, the uncertainty will always be at the back of my mind, and I never know for sure when the day will come when my camera fails and there will be no parts left. And that is actually the reality and risk involved in getting a camera like this. Number 6, the viewfinder. Okay, I may be expecting too much, but I feel that the viewfinder lines are a little bit too thick, and that can be a bit distracting, and it makes the distortion a bit more obvious. Also, if you're wearing glasses, be very careful, as you might scratch your lens just by looking through the viewfinder. Not sure if you can tell, but the edges of the opening of the viewfinder are not rounded, and they have very hard corners. So any contact with those edges will actually leave a scratch mark on your glasses, and trust me, I speak from experience. Number 7, power management. So apparently if you do not use your camera, if you leave it on, it will still continue to drain power from the battery. So if you're not planning to use your camera for a very long time, be sure to turn it off and remove the batteries. If you've forgotten to turn it off and if you leave your batteries in them, you could potentially have to deal with leaking batteries, and that could actually cause damage to your camera permanently. So do take note. And there you have it, 7 things I like and dislike about the Nikon L35AF. Overall, I feel that this is a very solid camera, and I'm very lucky to have the chance to own it and use it. And if you're looking for a point and shoot camera, not necessarily a L35AF, I hope this video would also help you form your own set of considerations in what to look for in a camera that will suit your needs. Once again, thank you for watching until the end of the video. Before I end it, I would like to take some time to congratulate Stanley as the winner for my giveaway in my previous video on film canister tin types. If you haven't watched that video, I will leave a link here or here. If you don't see it, that means I haven't figured it out, but I'll definitely try and figure it out so they can watch it. I hope to do more giveaways in my future videos, so don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel, and also hit that bell notification so that you'll be notified when I release new content in the future. Until then, stay safe and I'll see you soon. Bye!